There is a reason why humans invented the expression that says, lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place. It is because there are things or events that are so improbable, so absurd, so ridiculous, so cosmically coincidental, that if they happen, it is certain that they will never happen again, because the context in which that event or cause occurred will never be exactly the same as at the moment it occurred. And I think that one of those moments or events in question is the invention, or rather, the accidental creation of gunpowder. To think that such a powerful discovery was initiated with the desire to find a potion for immortality is one of the most improbable and absurdly funny events in history, depending on your type of humor. What I mean by all this is that the Chinese were not destined to discover gunpowder. It was a complete coincidence which could have happened to any other civilization at any other time, or perhaps never. I think there are certain events or discoveries that would inevitably occur even if it were much later than in our timeline, such as the Industrial Revolution. But we have grown accustomed to accepting such a limited understanding of the technological evolution of civilizations throughout our history that we believe it is impossible for an industrialized civilization to not have discovered the idea or concept of firearms with gunpowder. When the reality is that the discovery of gunpowder is, in terms of our history and evolution as civilizations, anecdotal and not necessary because of something we have reached it naturally, it was a pure coincidence that had practically no chance of occurring. With all that explanation, what I really wanted to ask in this video is the question of whether that absurd coincidence that occurred in China of the Tang Dynasty would have occurred much earlier in our history and in another part of the world. What if Rome had discovered gunpowder? That's the alternate story we are going to see today. Firstly, I have to apologize for a lie I just told. It was not the Romans who discovered gunpowder in this timeline, but the Greeks many centuries before Roman domination. So why this video's title is not "What if the ancient Greeks discovered gunpowder?" Because let's be real for a moment, if I had put that title, the video wouldn't be so brandable. Blame the YouTube algorithm, not me. So, in any case, why did I choose to let the ancient Greeks discover gunpowder and not the Romans? Well, for two reasons mainly. First of all, if I had chosen that the Romans literally discovered gunpowder, it would have to be at a time historically close to its peak. I think we can all agree that having the Romans discover gunpowder in the time of the kings or the beginning of the Republic before the sacking by the Gauls is something that sounds too crazy and strange to be an interesting idea. But then you could tell me that I simply had to make them discover gunpowder later in their history, after they had already defeated Carthage, or even after they had already started the empire, but that would also be a mistake and not a very interesting one. Remember, medieval Europe did not instantly start using firearms the moment they discovered the existence of gunpowder. It was a centuries-long process of trial and error that resulted in the firearms the Spanish used in the New World when they discovered America, not just something that happened overnight. In order for a civilization to reach the technological level necessary to use gunpowder weapons, it can take on average between 2 and 3 centuries. If I were to allow the Romans of Augustus to discover gunpowder, it would take them at least 2 or 3 centuries to arrive at prototypes that could resemble the firearms that Europeans of the 14th or 15th century invented in our timeline. By then, the empire would have entered in a complete decline in all aspects, and would no longer have the resources or the innovative incentive to create new weapons so complex and advanced for its time. Then again, not the most believable scenario. Besides, let's be honest, what we really want to see is Romans using firearms, not the process that would lead them to use them. And that would bring me to my second point, lack of creativity. When people analyze the industrial or technological potential that the Romans had in their prime, they tend to confuse creativity, initiative, and innovation. The Romans were highly innovative and were capable of taking great initiative in copying, adapting, and improving the technologies, sciences, and knowledge of other cultures with which they interacted or conquered, but they had a total lack of creativity to allow the craziest possible ideas to come from the minds of their engineers and other scientists and geniuses of their time. While the Greeks were the other way around, they were extremely creative, having developed their abstract thinking to very high levels, which made them have the strangest and most original ideas of their time, but they lacked the incentive, interest, and sense of innovation to put those ideas and creativity into practice. And it is for that reason, mainly, that I decided that in this story, it would be the Greeks who during their golden age in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, who accidentally during multiple experiments with different substances, products, chemicals, and so on, would eventually discover gunpowder by pure accident, in the same explosive and shocking way that the Chinese did in our timeline almost 1500 years later. And as I said before, while the Romans, following that discovery, would have persisted in investigating the properties and the technological and military potential of using gunpowder, the Greeks would have quickly abandoned the idea of playing with something as dangerous and lethal as that strange substance they had discovered. The Greeks would have acknowledged the existence of this substance and spoken and written about it regarding its formula and its functioning or general usefulness, but it would have been seen as a strange discovery that could be compared to sorcery, and it would have been considered very dangerous and not recommended trying new experiments with it. Later, during the time of Alexander the Great, perhaps in his attempts to optimize the efficiency and speed of his conquests, the Macedonian emperor and king would try to experiment again with gunpowder to take advantage of it as a formidable weapon against the Persians. But, again, I highly doubt that his short reign as the greatest conqueror in history up to that point would have allowed for any kind of innovation. And after the fragmentation of his empire among his generals, gunpowder would again become a substance forgotten by the Hellenic world, considered too dangerous to be used efficiently in battles or wars. And later again, after the Romans had risen to power in the Mediterranean, defeating their greatest rival until then, Carthage, and in the same year as their final victory over their Phoenician rivals, they would finally conquer the Greeks too, the Hellenistic influence would begin to spread throughout the Roman world, bringing with it various knowledge that would aid in innovations in all fields of the Romans, including gunpowder. And while the Greeks, faced with the extreme danger of using gunpowder, quickly gave up trying to find a useful use for it, the Romans would have persisted as long as necessary to use this formidable substance to the advantage of their conquests and wars. I have no doubt that during the experimental process of adapting gunpowder into weapons adapted to it, Roman artisans and engineers would have suffered an incalculable number of deaths, greatly slowing down the innovations that could have been brought by the adoption of gunpowder due to the terror it provoked in all those foolish enough to work with it. But, as I said previously, it is in the Roman mentality to embrace all kinds of innovation and improve it for their own benefits, and no matter how much it would cost economically or in human lives to achieve it, once the Romans got their hands on gunpowder, they would not stop experimenting with it until they found the ideal use for what would eventually become the first prototypes of firearms of that timeline. And I think that only someone as bold as Julius Caesar could be the perfect person to be the first to concretely test the effectiveness of primitive firearms in a conquest like the one he was going to undertake in Gaul. At that point in history, I think it's reasonable to assume that after 2 centuries of experimentation with gunpowder, the Romans would have the capacity to produce firearms at a technological level similar to that which the Spanish had at the time of their discovery of America in our timeline. However, it seems unrealistic to assume that by that point, the production and manufacturing of firearms would have been sufficiently democratized to be widespread in the Roman army, so Julius Caesar would have to use his growing fortune to progressively finance the production of primitive firearms throughout his campaign in Gaul. So, during the early stages of the conquest of Gaul, Julius Caesar's men would still be mostly classical Roman legionaries like those in our timeline, but progressively, with the passage of time, and the increase in the production of firearms with Caesar's personal financing, the soldiers would have easier access to firearms, being a brutal advantage for the dictator's conquests. However, I do not think the conquest of Gaul will be any shorter than in our timeline, probably still being a conquest about the same 8 years as originally. For the simple fact that even if Julius Caesar's men had access to firearms, they would still need to be trained in using those weapons and how to maintain them, in addition to the fact that Julius Caesar himself would have to adapt his military strategies and tactics in his battles with the Gauls, but using firearms, which at times ironically would complicate the conquest more than in our timeline. But still, Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul would be total and absolute, even more so than in our timeline, with the psychological effect of firearms on the Gauls' morale having been even more devastating to their defeat than in our timeline. But if I take so long to summarize the conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar in this timeline, it is to mention another important detail apart from how obvious it is that Julius Caesar was the first Roman general to have carried out a successful military campaign with firearms, definitively demonstrating their usefulness and effectiveness compared to more primitive weapons. And the important detail is that in this timeline, Julius Caesar's brief attempt to conquer Britain could be an actual success this time around. Because when you think about it again, if we compare it to the Spanish colonizers of America in our timeline, firearms were such a game-changing factor in their colonial success that in less than a year the Spanish were able to conquer a gigantic territory like the Inca Empire with less than 500 men. So, now imagine a legion of thousands of men with firearms and cannons conquering a territory dozens of times smaller than the territory the Spanish conquered in our timeline. Simply put, it would be overkill. Now, I'm not saying that Caesar would conquer all of Britain up to the Hadrian's borders, but he would maintain at least a firm hold on the southern coast of the island, with only a few hundred men being needed to hold and protect that territory without any problems, thanks to firearms and cannons. After that even more crushing and successful campaign of Julius Caesar than in our timeline, I don't think the rest of his reign would change at all, because in our timeline, his victory and domination over the entire Roman Republic as dictator was already highly probable. With the capabilities he had under that context, having firearms would only be an extra to win the civil war against Pompey, nothing more. But it's funny to think that in this timeline, when Julius Caesar would be assassinated, he would be killed perhaps with a gunshot, and not with several senators stabbing him with knives, being the first leader in history to be assassinated in that way. Later, I think that the subsequent events would occur similarly to those in our timeline, only with the addition of firearms in the following conflicts that would lead to the civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony, with Octavian still having all the chances in his favor to win the conflict. Now, with much of Julius Caesar's fortune inherited and most of his veteran legions loyal to Octavian, and with the experience using firearms and cannons, I have no doubt that Octavian would continue to win in the long run against Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the east. Of course, Mark Antony was also part of Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul and Britain in this timeline, and would be fully aware of the tremendous potential of firearms, but he would now have to start from scratch in the east, having to finance weapons production workshops, train new builders of those same weapons, and subsequently form new legions in the east, and have them adopt a military style more fitting to the use of those same firearms. And that is something that takes time to do. A lot of time, while Octavian and Julius Caesar's legions would already have the experience and knowledge necessary to make and use those firearms, making that, although not a decisive victory, maybe at least exactly the same victory as in our timeline with Octavian winning the Civil War, and eventually reforming the entire Roman government to start the Roman Empire as its first emperor, now with the name of Augustus. Now, the interesting thing about Augustus's reign in this timeline would be the military reforms he would apply compared to our history. I think that in this timeline, Augustus could have reformed the Roman army more drastically, being able to greatly reduce the number of men per Roman legion once the use of firearms had been fully democratized. Perhaps instead of 5,000 or 6,000 men per Roman legion, only 500 would be more than enough to be a group of soldiers significant enough to prevail on the battlefield against the enemies of Rome, being now extremely easy for the Romans to maintain and conquer new territories, thanks to being for the moment the only civilization in the world with the knowledge and technology necessary to manufacture firearms. In that context, Augustus would not have had as many reservations about overexpanding the empire as he did in our timeline, being probably able to consolidate Julius Caesar's conquest in Britain, eventually expanding across the entire island as far north as Caledonia, because once again, firearms would be an unparalleled game changer for any population, no matter how civilized or primitive they were compared to the Romans of that reality. And also, Augustus' reign was a very long one of the longest in the history of the Roman Empire, and obviously during his reign he would have continued to massively fund research into improving firearms and new types of weapons that could run on gunpowder. By the end of Augustus's reign, weapons would have been much more advanced than during Julius Caesar's time, being much more effective with better range and easier to maintain and reload. In that context, it seems unlikely to me that in this timeline the Romans would not be able to conquer the Germans, even if it would be a difficult conquest. Again, firearms would change everything in that type of conflict. In that timeline, the Romans would be an extremely feared and respected empire and power, even more so than in our history, being able to impose far more concessions on their enemies than in our timeline, and with their knowledge of the use of gunpowder many centuries ahead of other civilizations, including the Parthians, no one could replicate the advanced firearms technology that the Romans had at that time. With all that in mind, it wouldn't seem surprising to me that in this timeline, by the time Trajan comes to power, in addition to all the conquests he already made in our original story, he could also conquer and completely destroy the Parthian Empire, completely destroying the Persian civilization and returning those territories under Western control in a way that hasn't happened since the time of Alexander the Great. By that point, firearms technology would have improved monstrously, probably having a level of weapons technology similar to that of the Europeans prior to the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, being able to firmly reassert their control over their conquered territories, becoming the largest and most powerful empire in history up to that point. But even if the lack of men was no longer a problem for expanding and maintaining control of the empire's territories, the logistics of managing such a gigantic empire would still be a huge problem, and also another consequence of exposing other peoples and civilizations to the Roman world. And that problem would be that after a few decades or centuries of exposing new territories to the Roman world and its technologies, it is inevitable that other conquered peoples like the Persians could eventually learn to use and replicate minimally functional firearms to challenge the central authority of the Roman Empire. And after the end of the Pax Romana and the 5 good emperors, with all the conflicts to come, the Romans would now also have to manage several armed rebellions in different parts of that immense territory, creating a much more brutal and destructive alternate 3rd century crisis. Imagine the catastrophe of almost global scale that a crisis like that of the 3rd century would be, but with a territory twice as large as in our timeline, and with super advanced firearms for the time, with cannons and new prototypes of weapons such as bombs or grenades, which could create a calamity without equal up to that point in human history, being a conflict that could be compared in scale to at least the First World War in terms of destruction and human losses. It is impossible for me to consider the possibility that the Roman Empire of this timeline could survive without collapsing after such a conflict, no matter if someone like Aurelian appeared to try to fix things. Simply put, the empire was too big, and the amount of destruction and deaths would be too high per region of the empire to maintain that gigantic territory, with the Roman Empire, as we know it, falling already at the end of the 3rd century, dividing between several smaller empires, but still maintaining a Greco-Roman cultural identity, with the Germans not replacing the Latin or Hellenic culture in the West, because they had been integrated into the empire for centuries and had been completely Romanized by that point. After that brutal war and the fragmentation of the empire, a very dark period for Greco-Roman civilization would probably begin, with that part of the world suffering a high level of depopulation due to the number of deaths caused by war, famine, and diseases that this alternative 3rd century crisis caused in this timeline. The Middle Ages of this reality would be completely different and unrecognizable from the one we knew in our true history, being a land divided between multiple kingdoms or empires descended from the Roman Empire, which would constantly fight each other to gain power and influence over their neighbors, always innovating technologically in the weapons field to gain an advantage over their enemies, causing over time an early industrial revolution, although having advances and progress very different and much slower than in our timeline. Being a very strange kind of steampunk Middle Ages, that would be a completely alien world for us. From there, I can only see 2 conclusions to the future of that alternate Western world. Either eventually one of the empires or kingdoms descended from the original Roman Empire manages to obtain the technological and weapons advantage necessary to reconquer other Roman territories and thus legitimize its position as the true heir of the Roman Empire. Or one of those kingdoms or empires would develop a weapon powerful enough to annihilate much of humanity, similar to a nuclear bomb long before then in our timeline, thus ending any trace of what was once the Western civilization. Although, of course, that would be the most pessimistic case, perhaps simply over time those kingdoms and empires would find a mutual understanding between them until they become what would appear to us modern nations of our reality. One thing is certain, for centuries, perhaps even up to the present day, these nations, kingdoms, or empires would spend all that time trying to legitimize themselves as the true heirs of Rome, with the hope and goal of one day reuniting what was once the Roman Empire. And all of this was due to the accidental discovery of gunpowder by some Greeks in antiquity. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.